Time for our next presenter, and then we're going straight through to lunch. So everybody get comfortable. Hope you have something to drink. Let's get everybody in out of the hallways, close the door. All right, I'd like to ask to come up to introduce our next speaker, our board member and the man with the beautiful voice who sang the national anthem last night, Gary Hoffmeister.
Well, all I'm going to do first is to introduce a short film.
If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. You didn't get there on your own. I'm always struck by people who think, well, it must be because I was just so smart. There are a lot of smart people out there. It must be because I worked harder than everybody else. Let me tell you something. There are a whole bunch of hard-working people out there. If you were successful, somebody along the line gave you some help. There was a great teacher somewhere in your life. Somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we had that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
We have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. You can see heroes every day going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us and then the world beyond. You meet heroes across a counter, and they're on both sides of that counter. There are entrepreneurs with faith in themselves and faith in an idea who create new jobs, new wealth, and opportunity. They're individuals and families who take taxes, support the government, and whose voluntary gifts support church, charity, culture, art, and education. Their patriotism is quiet but deep. Their values sustain our national life.
There's a lesson never to be forgotten here. It's people, not government, who create wealth, provide growth, and ensure prosperity. The history of our economic difficulties stem directly from our failure to remember that government consumes wealth. It doesn't create it. American working men and women have much of which to be proud. It was the hard work and skill of working people that turned a vast American wilderness into the world's most powerful economy. Leaders all over the world have asked how we achieve this growth and prosperity. Well, my answer is simple. Less government, more freedom. Our working people are still the most productive on the planet. I've always believed that given the tools and equipment they need, and on a level playing field, American workers can outcompete and beat the pants off anybody, anywhere. In these last few years, we've reignited our citizens' faith in themselves and their country and put our economy back on track. The gains we've made did not happen by accident, and they should not be taken for granted. You know, some people say it's America's natural resources that make our country so great. But the greatest resource of all is our working men and women, their skill, hard work, guts, and determination. God gave us this great and good land, but it's up to us to make it flourish, to preserve its freedom and to see it grow in greatness.
The crisis we're facing today does not require of us the kind of sacrifice that Martin Treptow and so many thousands of others were called upon to make. It does require, however, our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
Prepare to be challenged. In the interest of complete disclosure, I have to tell you that Dana Rohrabacher is my son-in-law. That transpired a few years ago. We had been good friends and done a lot of traveling together, mostly on congressional trips. And then he decided to get married over in southern France, and I went to the wedding. And when I saw the good-looking girl he was marrying, I said, oh, I wonder what her mother looks like. And so 2 years later, I married her mother, and that's how my friend, true story. That's how my friend became my son-in-law. The first trip that Dana and I took, just to give you an idea of the kind of guy he was, we went to Nicaragua to dig up some graves where the communist Sandinistas had machine gunned 38 poor campesinos for not going along with the collectivization program. And we had the secret police chasing us around for the weekend. It was quite an exciting weekend. This, by the way, led to a fairly funny story getting together with my friend Mike Pence that many of you met here many years ago with the first Steamboat Institute. By the way, just in case you're wondering, people have asked me how Mike is doing. He's leaving Congress, running for governor in Indiana, and the last poll had him 50 to 32. Not too shabby. Anyway, Dana runs into Mike on the street, and he says, Mike, you got to come with me on my next trip. And he starts to tell him about it, and Mike says, Dana, hold on. And Dana says, what's the matter? He said, I forgot to tell you, but I made a promise to my wife and children, my goal for the end of my first year in Congress. And Dana said, yeah? He said, well, the goal is not dead. He said, that precludes all trips with Dana Rohrabacher. That's the kind of reputation he has. This is kind of the antithesis of what you heard yesterday from a certain academic. This is an honest man. This is a loyal man. This is a great patriot. And a man that goes back, boy, in the spirit of the Steamboat Institute, to the Founding Fathers, the Constitution. I mean, virtually anything that's brought up in our constant conversations that's going on with the issues of today, he relates back to the founding of this country and thinking not only of what we're doing right now, but what the country is going to be in 10, 30, 50 years. This is the kind of man that we want in Congress. He's been here in Congress for 24 years now. He was 7 years before that as a speechwriter for President Reagan that you just saw. So this is very apropos that Rick put together this great film. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher.
Yes, I'm the only one here who can call Gary Dada. And it is my honor to be here with you, especially considering that this is a tribute to my very, very close friend and dear friend, Tony Blankley. And nothing could be a better tribute to Tony than a spirited discussion of freedom. And so I'm very pleased to be joining you in that tribute to Tony. I just, a few thoughts prior to some of the things that I was going to mention in my speech. A few thoughts about Dr. Black yesterday, Professor Black. First of all, I have no doubt that Professor Black is an honest man and not a liar. You get it? I mean, what kind of, why do these liberals always have to attribute people who disagree with them to being dishonest and being liars? And why is that? I mean, that is their central argument every time you confront a liberal leftist. And I thought that was unsavory and just, especially when he included Paul Ryan in on that, was just horrible. And did not have the time to. I'm sorry that he is not here, but I would say that to his face. And a lot of times people are wrong. A lot of people are wrong, but they're not liars. And not to say there aren't liars, because we know there are. But when you are trying to work and create a spirit of goodwill and freedom where we can try to work out our problems, it doesn't help by calling them liars. That's the first thing. However, with that said, for an academic to point his fingers at politicians and say they're a bunch of liars, well, let me put it this way. After seeing world-acclaimed academics perpetuating the worst fraud in the history of the human race, man-made global warming on the rest of us, they don't have any room to complain about politicians. Academics will go out of their way to what? To make sure that someone who disagrees with them doesn't get a position in their school or in their department of their university. They will, and as we saw from the emails that were finally made, gladly we got a chance to see them, from these academics who were backing man-made global warming as a theory, they were willing to stop people from being published, trying to get people fired, and how to shut somebody up. And of course, the biggest thing we've all heard over the years on that debate was, case closed. Well, what was case closed? Why was everybody saying? That was an attempt to eliminate debate. That was a heavy-handed shut up. And this guy's pointing his fingers at politicians. Well, yeah, politicians have got some problems. And let me just say, in terms of specifically economic professors, in my background, or in my history, I think that economists quite often, well, let's put it this way, they're the only profession I know that can see something working totally in practice, but they won't believe it till they see if it works in theory. And of course, we know about these things about academics because we had a Secretary of State under Richard Nixon that taught us all of the graciousness and openness, mindedness of what academics are all about. I'm sure you remember who I'm talking about. So with that said, let me go on to some of the remarks that I had in mind for you today. And, about the Secretary of State, let me just note that I really thought the John Bolton speech last night was terrific, and it was right on target. And I disagree with him on a couple thoughts, but let me note his focus on making sure that America maintains its sovereignty and that we prevent this globalism from stealing away our freedom and our ability to control our own destinies. That has got to be one of our major thrusts of anyone who loves freedom. And we've seen how the United Nations works, and to give more authority to the United Nations, half of the members of the UN, half of their countries are governed by lunatics and gangsters. And that's the last group of people that we want to have a veto power over our children's future. And I mentioned Henry Kissinger a moment ago, and let me just note, when I was a young reporter, I had a chance to interview Kissinger a number of times when he came out to California with Richard Nixon, and I'll never forget that. Henry Kissinger, remember he wrote this, I remember a reporter asked him, he said, you sound like you think you're smarter than God. And Kissinger's response was, well, no, but that's Reagan, no. I can't imitate Kissinger. He said, no, but I think I am smarter than God was at my age. And and last night, as I was thinking about that and I was listening to Bolton's speech and the foreign policy implications, I couldn't help but notice there was a bottle of Argentinian wine on the table. Now, coming from California, let me just say that we in California are wine snobs, and we know that other countries especially Argentina, doesn't necessarily make as good a wine as California. We in California are way ahead of the curve. In fact, if you drink cheaper wines, as some of the older gentlemen, including myself, can tell you, that means that during the evening you're going to have to get up a few times during the night. Well, we in California are developing a wine to counteract that. We're calling it Pinot Noir. And finally, then I'll get into, it is difficult for, Reagan always said, well, Dana, start off with a little funny story. And there is a story, you know, and having been a speechwriter for Reagan, it puts me at a great disadvantage because people expect me to be able to speak like Ronald Reagan, which I obviously cannot. And also, let me just note, he was a tremendous writer. He taught me how to write. He was, we always said if he was not the president, he was good enough to be the president's speechwriter. And, but he did tell us to start out with a story. And while I don't speak like Ronald Reagan, I do have a story about the people with the command of the language, and that's lexicographers. You know what a lexicographer is? That's a man who specializes in dictionaries. And the world's most renowned, and America's most renowned lexicographer was Noah Webster. And one day, Noah Webster's wife unexpectedly burst into his office, and there was Noah, and there was a blonde lady sitting in his lap. And Noah Webster's wife shouted, "Noah, I'm surprised." To which Noah replied, "No, my dear, we are surprised. You are astonished." So, well, let's go through some facts and figures that may be of surprise, but certainly, well, maybe won't astonish you. Let me note that we are confronted today with what I believe is the greatest challenge to our freedom that our country has faced perhaps one or two times in our country's history. And unless we do our job, and especially in these next few months, to see that we no longer have a Marxist president 6 months from now, we will lose it. And there, this discussion yesterday with Professor Black, we need to do more than just discuss the budget. I know that people on the left like to think that everything centers around government and the budget. Well, at least we Republicans have been courteous enough to the American people to provide a budget for them to see what our, what we believe should be done, which is you can't say that for the Democrats. But the challenge that we are confronting is going to take more than just a focus on the budget and coming to budget agreements. We are going to need to restructure our government, and yes, restructure the way our economy and the way people interact with this behemoth government that's emerged in our country. So it's not just sitting down with budget figures, but to make sure that we do things differently in the United States, because we now have, over $5 trillion more in debt than we had 3 years ago, or 3.5 years ago. $5 trillion. What's the interest rate on $5 trillion? What is it? Our children, we have just committed, or we have permitted to our government to commit one of the gravest sins against the young people of this country that has ever been committed before in the history of our country. $5 trillion in debt. We are not confronted by monstrous threat of communism or Japanese militarism or Nazism, where in the past we had to have a debt in order to counteract some massive evil force that was contrary to everything we believed in as Americans and threatened the world. No, we've had $5 trillion in debt, more added to our children's future. And the young people, I don't think they understand that as we're paying the interest to that, that's coming out of the same pool of wealth that's supposedly going to pay for good jobs for them, or supposedly going to pay for their health care and their education and all the other needs that they have for their homes. So we are now in a situation where we've got to act and dramatically act, all of us, or that $5 trillion will bring us down, and our currency will collapse. Within, I would predict, within 4 years, you will see a currency collapse if we re-elect this president and continue along this same path. And what does a currency collapse mean? That means an entire collapse of our economic system. That's just how threatened we are. Now, so what do we do? What do we do to thwart that and to make sure that doesn't happen? First of all, as I say, it's not just a budget matter. We've got to produce more wealth in this country. Bringing down the deficit doesn't just mean cutting the budget and keeping taxes under control. We've got to produce more wealth. We've got to find ways of doing things better, more efficiently, utilizing our natural resources, making farmers more productive, making sure that people who are doing business are more efficient at that. All of these things create more wealth. And in all of these things, of course, we've got an administration now which is the enemy of producing more wealth because their focus is on distribution of wealth. Well, that distribution of wealth ain't going to do it if you've got $5 trillion more in debt. That doesn't work then. It doesn't have any impact, any positive impact. So what are the things that I would suggest in terms of, of what we can do to make sure we put our country back on a track where we can be in prosperity 4 and 5 years down the road, rather than seeing a currency collapse and the collapse of the future for our children. One of the things the professor noted yesterday was what? Well, if we cut off these subsidies and things like the Republicans want, people are going to die. The children are going to die. Remember that? Holy cow. I mean, give me a break. The first thing I want to talk about, New Zealand. He was comparing, Professor Black was comparing us to Europe and all. Do you remember how many people have studied what happened in New Zealand 15, 20 years ago? Raise your hand if you have. If you haven't, please look up what happened in New Zealand. New Zealand in the 70s and the 80s went so far overboard to the left that their economy was collapsing. And they knew it was either going to be, they're going to either have to create a Eastern European style, heavy-handed socialism, government owns everything, everybody takes orders, or they were going to have to go the opposite route. And even the Labour government in New Zealand figured it out. And the type of change that they put in place that saved their country and turned it around is what we should be looking at, not what our European friends are doing and not, all of that mishmash talk that we heard yesterday. And what happened in New Zealand? Gary actually went with me on my trip to New Zealand years ago when I went to see exactly what had worked. Now, and what they did is they ended all subsidies. They ended all subsidies. They sold all the operations that the government was conducting, and they sold it and made it into a private sector operations. For example, if the professor was right, all the sheep would be dead in New Zealand because they cut all the subsidies and massive subsidies to the sheep industry, to lamb. Have you gone to the market lately? I mean, lamb from New Zealand is all over the world now, and they're making money at it. But I visited a sheep farm. Gary, were you with me when we did that? Okay. And these guys were there, and they had huge sheep. And they said, well, we were really afraid. All of us were used to these subsidies, and we thought that we'd have to close down and there wouldn't be any more sheep if they did that, right until the moment that they did that. And then we realized, well, we're not going to give up and just walk away. We're going to try to make a go of this. And we now have a very profitable sheep farm. Well, I said, well, how did you make this profitable? And he said, this guy goes, well, and we were out there with the sheep and everything. He says, well, when we got this subsidy, we didn't really care so much about the details. And what is the most costly, he was asking me, what is the most costly element of sheep raising. What's the most costly factor? We had to look at all the factors. What was the most costly factor? I said, I don't know. And he said, well, it's trimming the hoofs of the sheep. And I didn't know that. And sheep had to have their hooves trimmed. Very labor intensive, very costly. And he said, then we noticed that some sheep didn't have to have their hooves trimmed. And what they did was breed the sheep that didn't have to have their hooves trimmed and bred their sheep so their hooves didn't have to be trimmed. And he said, we never would have thought of that had we been under the subsidy. So are all the sheep dead? No, there's more sheep now, and they're easier to raise, and people all over the world now are a lot healthier and happier, having more wealth, more meat to consume. I know that the PETA people will disagree with me with that. Somebody told me that PETA stands for people eating tasty animals or something. No. But in short, what we have got to do is think like the New Zealanders had to think. How do we restructure our society and the way we do things? So let me give you a few examples of that. I remember when we first took over the majority, the Republicans in 1994, this was the first bill that I proposed. And Newt, to this day, when he sees me, he tells me that one of the great regrets he has is that he did not follow up on this alternative, which we had then, which is much more difficult today. And that is, we need to take the U.S. Post Office and turn it over to its employees and make it the biggest employee-owned corporation in the world, and then set it loose to compete with everybody else. And I happen to believe that we should be expanding employee ownership. I'm an ESOP guy, et cetera. But with the U.S. Post Office, that strategy is what will work, because otherwise the politics of it won't work. But remember, there used to be private sector companies that delivered mail. Lysander Spooner did that back in the 1800s, and they drove him out of business. But more importantly, right now, you've got United Parcel Service and Federal Express and all kinds of services that deliver things and make a profit, while our own post office is floundering and leaves us under the gun for billions of dollars. So that's number one. Let's eliminate the post office as being a federal entity during a government entity. Our founding fathers thought it was important because that's the way technology was at that time. You needed to keep people together. You needed to have that postal service. That need went out of business a long time ago. Now, you've heard also that, and conservatives tend to really believe in the space program. And I believe in the space program. My father was a Marine lieutenant colonel, and he actually set up the flight with John Glenn to go across the country, the fastest speed they ever did across the country. And unfortunately, my dad's plane, something happened to it, and he couldn't take off, and so it was John Glenn that went across. My dad was almost an astronaut. So, I mean, but I was raised around airplanes and technology, and I do believe America should be the leading power in space. With that said, that does not mean that NASA, which is a huge organization of government employees, should dominate America's space effort. And some of the conservatives, including my good friend John Bolton last night, I'm going to talk to him privately and clue him in on what's going on. The one thing that I would say about this administration is its space policy is not bad. And I'm on the science committee, and I'm a senior member of that committee. In fact, what I've tried to do, I'm the author of the Commercial Space Act of 2004. And what that did is lay the legal foundation. Of course, I almost didn't get it passed because it had informed consent. And you know, lawyers will never agree to informed consent, that if people are dealing with, if people are going to be involved with commercial space and they're going to go up in a spacecraft, they have the right to sign off their liability. Well, lawyers can't accept that. The Democratic Party is controlled by lawyers, et cetera. I didn't think I was going to get that passed. We got it passed, the last bill, the last day, back in 2004. That has laid the foundation of an entirely new industry. The commercial space industry is becoming so viable now that how many of you noticed that the last time we resupplied the space station, it was with a private company? SpaceX? Raise your hand if you noticed that. Well, a lot of people didn't notice it, but let me give you some statistics on it. Had NASA done it the way they've been doing it before, it would have cost the taxpayer twice as much as what SpaceX was charging. And SpaceX made a little profit on it too. And SpaceX pays taxes. None of that would have been true under NASA. If you put that into the equation, what kind of burden does that put on all of us? Well, I happen to believe that we need to continue to be the country that leads the way in exploring in space. What we should basically have is government should not be providing transportation any longer, whether it's space or anywhere else. The private sector can do this. We have now reached a level in our space transportation systems, just like we did in jet and other aviation technology, where you can have private companies actually providing air transportation rather than having a government do it. By the way, what would happen if United Airlines was a government airlines and that's all there was the choice, is just United? And then, of course, every time a plane was flown across the country, well, it would just throw it away. And then they have to build a whole new airplane because they've actually done the mission of the airplane. Where private sector people say, well, no, we need a piece of technology that you can reuse. Surprise, surprise. That's what's going on in commercial space. And we are dramatically bringing down the cost. Private companies are. Thank God for Burt Rutan, who is actually leading the way on this. So the government doesn't have to do something like is as ingrained in us that NASA has to do these things. Government has to do it. No. We can do these things. We can utilize space, put it to use for the benefit of humankind without having the federal government being the lead player in that. And that gets back to public transportation. I'm sorry, we have to get away from the fact that the government is here to subsidize everybody's transportation. I mean, Eisenhower had a good idea, and it was a great idea. He set up a road system which is going to be paid for by the people who use it through the gas tax. And then, of course, what we've done is compromise the integrity of that whole strategy by then having that gas tax subsidize everybody else, whether they're on the roads or not. And we've got to put ourselves, and we've got to basically say, if something doesn't make sense economically, just like with the sheep folks, that they should not necessarily be in business. Well, these guys, people who live in big cities, they go, how would we possibly have big bus companies, and they're all subsidized? Well, let me note, some cities don't have totally subsidized buses, and some cities don't need, I see these buses go by all the time in Southern California, 1 or 2 people on the bus. But yet we are subsidizing that. Are there other alternatives? I will tell you, if we took the New Zealand approach, we would find other alternatives. For example, we might want to license people in vans to run up and run jitney services all over our major cities, and that would all then charge, hey, for $1, I'll take you 4 blocks down. And that happens in a lot of other major cities, and especially in Asia. There's no reason we couldn't do that here. But that's the type of alternative that would emerge if we took the New Zealand approach to saving our country. How about education? I was reading the Constitution. I literally picked it up. I couldn't find the word education in the Constitution. Was I mistaken? Is it in there somewhere? No, it's not. Our founding fathers were very right that education should be kept at the state and local level, and that's that. And the further away we get from that, and the further down the quality of our education system gets, we're going to have to come to a realization. This is going to be tough because we've got people hooked on federal dollars. Well, let me tell you what happens. I see every group of young people from my district who come to visit Washington. Every one. Even if it's just 2 of them, even 1 of them, I'll make time for them. usually in groups of about 15 or 20. And they're asking me about things, and then I ask them. Well, first of all, because they're all, of course, concerned about education, their teachers have made sure they ask about that. And but they don't know that the federal government isn't the chief person that finances education. Right now, I believe 10% of education is financed through the federal government. Am I wrong in that statistic? Anyone here have a better? I think it's around 10%. Well, I ask these kids, I always say, have you driven by the Department of Education building? And then I said, if they don't, I said, make sure you do. And there are thousands and thousands of people in that education building. And they make good salaries, and they've got great retirements, and they go to conferences all over the United States and all over the world. And they stay in nice hotels when they go to the conferences. And all of that money that's being spent on those people is the part of the money that the government, federal government, is giving to education. And guess what? None of them ever see a student. Well, they get it. I think the American people will get it. And then I asked them, where is the money coming from? When their teachers ask you to talk about the federal money to education, where does the federal money come from? Have you been to the money pits? Well, no. And I said, remember, Washington, D.C. is just 64 square miles surrounded by reality. Okay? And I said, so you haven't been to the money pits. Well, have you been to the money trees? That's where the $1,000 bills grow off the trees. Oh, you're kidding us. Yes, I'm kidding them. Because there are no money pits and there are no money trees in which the federal government is getting all the federal money. And I tell these kids, so remember, for the rest of your life, when someone says federal money, what they really mean is the money the federal government has taken from your parents over here in California and then is demanding you do certain things in order to get it back. Well, we need to end that equation. It's time for us to get back to basics, and it's time for us basically just to say education should be up to, number one, the parents, number two, the local government, number three, the state government, but not the federal government. It's time to do that. And, I'm speaking too long here. Let me just say, we have a federal government right now that is anti-energy, and we need to make sure, obviously, we need to have a government that doesn't restrict the development of nuclear power plants and trying to prevent people from developing oil and gas. We need to make sure that we get a government that's pro-development, because all the new energy we get is new wealth. And we need to develop new wealth if we are going to solve these problems. So I'll leave it with that. And I really loved our Irish friend yesterday. That was just a tremendous presentation showing us how the man-made global warming theory is being used by people. And what is their real goal? Their goal is to centralize power in a global government. The reason they want to say it's man-made global warming because they want to control us. They want to control people. Okay, now, housing. And I know I'm going to step on some toes here. Obviously, in a crowd like this, everybody knows that federal housing projects are bad. We've seen it all our life. How you'll take a private sector-owned apartment, you turn it into a government-owned low-income housing. Within a matter of a year or two, it becomes what my friend from Ireland said, a shithole. Okay. It's not just that. I'm sorry, but our friends in Canada never had this bubble that almost destroyed their economy, okay? They never had it because the government is not deeply involved in everybody's housing transactions. We need to get rid of all of that excessive involvement in the housing by the federal government, and that means no more Freddie Mac, no more Fannie Mae. Let the market decide. And yes, the Canadians do not have as nice a housing as we've got. But you know what? Their housing component of their economy didn't almost destroy their economy either. And this isn't the first time. We get the government involved in, and I don't have to tell you, and I don't know what planet Professor Black is on, but Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have been used by, guess what, by the liberal establishment to enrich their cronies for years. And it's documented over and over again. What planet is this man living on who can't recognize that fact? Well, it's planet academe, of course. There you go. Well, how are we gonna solve that? Again, this is really tough. We've got to get back to the basics, restructure our system so that housing is no longer something that teeters one way or the other on what decisions are made in Washington, but instead, what decisions are made by people who want to live in this house or that house. It's as simple as that. Now, the last one is going to be the most controversial one that I bring up to you, because a significant number of you are going to strongly disagree with some of the points I'm about to make. I'll start with some of the ones that I think that we agree on. And this is when we're talking about national security as something that we've got to confront if we're going to bring down that level of deficit spending. It is very difficult for conservative Republicans to say no to someone wearing a uniform. But if we do not assert that authority, we ain't going to correct the problem. That is a big component of why we are in an economic mess. First of all, we do not have to rely simply on a large standing Army, Navy, Air Force for our nation's security. Our founding fathers understood that. Our founding fathers did not believe in large standing armies, nor did they believe in the draft. What we have is in the Constitution. Here's little hints. Do we all know what a bill of attainder is? Okay, our founding fathers decided that they were going to basically give license to privateers. Or, better put, they were going to hire mercenaries to go out and do some of the fighting, if not all the fighting, that needed to be done. Now, early in our country's history, as the British were no longer protecting our ships in the Mediterranean, because we were no longer under British control and protection, the Barbary pirates began attacking U.S. naval ships. Our reaction was, what our reaction would be, many reactions, we built 5 of the strongest ships and biggest technological up-to-date vessels in the world to go and deal with the Barbary pirates. And then they sent them off to Tripoli to bombard Tripoli until the bad guy who was running Tripoli, the bad sultan, gave in and agreed not to attack our ships. And what happened? The Philadelphia was one of the 5 ships. This would be the equivalent of our greatest aircraft carrier coming off the line today, brand new. And it sailed into Tripoli harbor, and immediately it landed on a sandbar and was totally disabled and captured by the enemy. Anybody read this? You should read our history about this. And all of a sudden, 300 American sailors were being held hostage by what would be considered radical Islamic enemy, okay? And there was a guy in the State Department named William Eaton. Please raise your hand if you've ever heard of William Eaton. Let me recommend that you study William Eaton, because it tells a lot about what succeeds in our national defense. William Eaton, first of all, during the Revolutionary War, because he had some command of languages and he lived on the frontier, he realized the British were enlisting Indian tribes to fight us and to murder the Continentals who were trying to become independent. How are we going to confront that? If George Washington would have sent colonial troops to confront the Indian attacks, the British would have won and along the coast. Well, William Eaton came forward with a plan, and he implemented it, of what? Finding all of the Indian tribes who were allied with the British, finding the other Indian tribes that hated those Indian tribes, and to support those Indian tribes in attacking the British allies. And that's what he did. And it was highly successful. If it wouldn't have been, it would have been, our American Revolution would have been a lot more difficult if we'd have succeeded at all. He gets very little credit for that, but what an incredible gift that he gave then. Well, he was working in the State Department. There's about 10 of them at that time. And he went to Thomas Jefferson when he read about this thing with the Philadelphia and the crew. That was the biggest trauma. They held these guys for 2 years, and we only had about 4 million people in the population. You can imagine what a trauma that was for early America. Well, William Eaton went to Jefferson and said, look, this guy, the Sultan, is really a horrible, bad guy. He deposed his brother 10 years ago, who's the legitimate governor of Tripoli. And all the people love this, the younger brother, but the big guy is a gangster, and I can go to that area where his brother is exiled in the desert. We will recruit his brother and attack Tripoli from the desert side. Sounds like Lawrence of Arabia, right? It was. It was Lawrence of Arabia, years before Lawrence of Arabia. So Jefferson said, that's a very good idea. And he went to Congress, and the Congressman said, you're out of your mind. You're the ones who sent those ships into Tripoli in the first place. We say you cannot do this. He did it anyway. He sent this guy over with a thing full of money and with a whole thing full of gold, and they dropped William Eaton and I think it was 12 U.S. Marines, and they found this guy and they built an army around that guy, and they marched across the desert, one of the great feats, and they attacked the second biggest city in Tripoli and won, and they were about to go up against the Sultan and win when the State Department sold them out. But the Sultan would never have made an agreement if William Eaton had not been there, and the American people knew that. He became a hero to the American people. Now, that story is important because of this. Yes, we need to develop a strategy which won in the Cold War. We did not win by deploying our troops everywhere or by being the policemen of the world. We won the Cold War when Ronald Reagan supported the enemy of our enemies. It's cheaper, it's very cheap, as compared to sending our troops and keeping them in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we have friends all over the world who like the United States and are the enemies of these vicious, evil, radical Muslims who hate everything we stand for. Let us side with the enemies of our enemies rather than spending so much money building up a standing army in order to occupy the world. We'll go broke if we do that. Thank you very much for letting me speak to you today.